Hello everyone, I'm Hannah Baker. I'm one of the directors at Cambridge Architectural Research and also a research associate at the University of Cambridge. Today, I would like to welcome you to our first ever online CAR showroom. For those of you that don't know CAR, it's an interdisciplinary research consultancy with topics including risk in the built environment, energy, cities, whilst also having practicing engineers in our structures team. Before COVID-19, after work on a Wednesday, we used to have monthly talks, which we call CAR showrooms. Obviously, we're unable to do that at the moment, but we thought that switching to online would be a good way to keep the momentum of those talks going. At this point, I would like to thank Janet and Natcha, who have put in a lot of work making this happen, by making the posters, sending out the invites, and also making sure that Zoom behaves itself today. So fingers crossed that it does. And of course, thanks in advance to our speaker, Nick Baker. Although we share a surname, as far as I'm aware, I don't think we're related. So normally at the in-person showrooms, there's a bit of time beforehand for us to mingle over a glass of wine or a non-alcoholic beverage and meet other people in the room. Obviously, you can eat and drink whatever you like right now, but the meeting each other is a bit more difficult in the online world. But just as a bit of context, looking at the emails of people registered, we've got people listening in from China, Greece, and throughout the UK, as well as former students of Nick's and current students at Cambridge's Architecture School, and a range of professionals in the built environment. So in terms of how today will work, Nick is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. There are a couple of options for questions. Ideally, we want it to be as interactive as possible. So after the talk, you can virtually raise your hands. So that option should be at the bottom of your screen, and it's a button that you need to press. And if we see this, we can then turn on your video and the sound, and you can ask the question. Just be aware that if you choose the video option, the webinar is being recorded and it might be put on YouTube. If you prefer not to be on video, you can type the question in the question and answer box, and you can actually do that during the presentation as well. And either Natural or myself will ask it on your behalf. You can be anonymous or your name can come up, but I will re-explain that again after Nick's presentation. So now on to our speaker. So Nick Baker originally studied physics and joined the University of Cambridge's Department of Architecture in 1985 to teach environmental design and take part in architectural research based at the Martin Centre. His research interests included energy modelling, daylight design and natural ventilation, and a continuing interest in the impact of human behaviour on building performance led to work on thermal comfort and wider aspects of comfort and well-being. He was a founding member of CAR, and he's currently a lecturer at the Architectural Association. So today, his talk is based on the recently published book, Healthy Homes, Designing with Light and Air for Sustainability and Wellbeing, jointly written with Koen Steemers. And so now I will pass over to Nick. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, Hannah, very much. And first of all, thank you, CAR, for inviting me to open this series. Everybody likes talking about their own work, of course, so it's a bit of an indulgence on my part. Nevertheless, I will try and keep to 30 minutes. Also, just to say hello to some of my colleagues and friends who I've seen on the list of participants, so it's very nice of you to put some time to listen to me. Okay, I'm going to go over to the screen share now. Okay, that should be my title slide, which I'm not going to speak very much about. So the book, Health and Wellbeing in Homes, it followed really a series of seminars that were organised by Velux. Velux, as the name suggests, is concerned with making windows, and concerned with light and air. And although that is a commercial product, I can assure you that Velux's influence on us was not a commercial one. In fact, the Velux Foundation funds all sorts of research. And then when we came to write the book, they withdrew from any sort of editorial influence at all. So I will have to thanks to Velux for initially promoting this work, and thanks to them also for leaving it to us. So the book, what we noticed at the seminars were that we would have spoken to by, say, a biologist or a behavioral psychologist, and they all, of course, went into great detail in some aspect of the environment. They sort of left us to, the architects there and the engineers, to kind of interpret that in terms of the built environment. So somebody would speak about, in great detail, about circadian rhythm. And you sort of felt, coming away from the seminar, that all that mattered in housing design was circadian rhythm, or all that mattered in was air quality. And so you tended to feel that there was all these influences pulling in opposite directions. And so our aim with this book was to try and form a balanced view of this, and to try and integrate them and draw attention to where there were conflicts. I mentioned in the blurb advertising the lecture that there are really direct conflicts, for example, in ingress of daylight and fresh air, and the ingress of noise and polluted atmosphere from road traffic. That's just one example. There are many, many other examples. Sunlight and overheating, we can go on. And we wanted to not exactly resolve those conflicts and optimize them, but simply draw attention to them and perhaps set the scene so that the designer could balance them and make some informed decision. Right, so the sort of structure of my talk is going to be follow the structure of the book. And the book was in 3 parts, and at first it was looking at the background, and particularly the literature which supported the concern about these various issues, various health issues. And it also looked at the sort of historical background and emerging codes and standards. Part 2 was mainly technical, and we found, as you've seen in the slides, that we were actually covering certain old ground. There was, you know, if we look at that list there, it looks much like any other sort of environmental textbook: microclimate, noise, thermal climate, thermal comfort, and all this stuff. We're all familiar with that. So we weren't really uncovering anything new, but we were perhaps trying to combine it in a relatively new way. Well, I hope so. And then part 3, we wanted to do case studies. Of course, every design guidance book wants to do case studies. And we, in the end, sort of gave up trying to find buildings that typified and illustrated all of the issues we wanted to do. So instead of that, we said, we're going to write plausible scenarios. In other words, we'll invent buildings, virtually invent them, maybe base them on real projects, but sort of invent them. And we will show what could have been done with them in order to illustrate how our recommendations could be turned into reality. Okay, well, the starting off historical point is just one other thing we found. We realized that this sort of this history of concern about the design of buildings or the built environment and its implications on health had a very, very long history. I mean, the Greeks were concerned with it. Yes, I may be wrong about the pronunciation, but Asclepian sanctuaries were quite obsessed with health and sunlight and the impact of sunlight. And of course, now particularly relevant to COVID is the work of Florence Nightingale. Interestingly here, I hope you can see the cursor, here is a perfect anti-COVID environment. You've got high-level windows which the warmer used air can leave, and you've got windows at low level to flood this with fresh air. It's setting up a nice convective circuit which will take the used air out of the building before it spreads to other people. Now, of course, we have low ceilings and we have air conditioning, which nicely mixes them all together. So we can learn a few things from this. Anyhow, I won't dwell on the history. It's a wonderful subject, but we'll move on. And the other thing we looked at was standards and codes of practice, and there are quite a number of them, which you see: Healthy Homes Barometer, Well Building Standard, 5 Ways of Wellbeing. And we found that it was interesting how they tended to be performance specifications. That is, they said what you ought to achieve, but not often actually told you very much about how to achieve it. So they weren't really design guidance. It was really what to aspire to. And also we found that what to achieve in terms of the performance specification varied very much in kind. So we'll have things like 5 ways of well-being, you know, connect, keep active, give, very sort of vague behavioral things. Whereas, sorry, I want to go back a minute. Whereas here, the Green Building Council was concerned with very, very specific things like low maintenance, no condensation, interestingly, views of nature, reduced noise. So in a way, more the kind of closer to actual kind of design responses. And this is just to sort of illustrate how we might begin to respond to some of these in design terms. And there's been a couple of projects at Cambridge which I've been involved in designing buildings in order to encourage activity. In fact, one of those was designing office buildings to persuade people to be more mobile. But of course, a house can also do that. And this is a bit of an extreme solution. You can imagine telling your teenage daughter to go up to her bedroom and she disappears up the wall like this. This would be quite amusing. But in a huff, you know, it would be quite good there. But this rather beautiful and rather costly looking staircase would be clearly a reward in itself to use, whereas many times staircases and corridors in buildings are just conduits which are kind of unfortunate necessities rather than celebrated. And that obviously extends to outside as well. So the idea of a design response, even to these very vague things like keep active, is touched on in the book, but is not dwelt on because we just don't know enough really to make prescriptive solutions to this. And there are some that I think stretch us to our limit. I'm not quite sure how you design the built environment to encourage people to give or keep learning, perhaps. Yes, that's possible. Okay, so now we're actually going to move on to the next section, which is more specific, although we start off with a fairly vague issue, which is something that has interested us for some time. And this is the question of access to nature. And this is really where we first started to confront the literature and evidence base. I should hope to bring that up again in the conclusions, the issue of setting out to do something evidence-based. It's such a nice phrase. It sounds so logical and defensible. Of course it should be evidence-based, but that is not so easy. So you can see that the references that really much of this work is based upon is Strife and Downey, childhood development and access to nature. This was actually studies done where deprived children who had learning difficulties were exposed to nature. Now this, we can say, yes, they did measure improvement, but does that mean that the average family living in the UK is going to have better health and well-being if they have access to nature? That is not proof, of course. And another very helpful work was by Chalfont, Design for Nature in Dementia Care. So what happens when people don't have dementia? Does that still apply? Can we extrapolate to that? So using evidence as a base is not obviously finding the right paper that exactly tells you about what you want to know. And there is an act of faith and judgment that has to translate this evidence into the more generic form of advice that you're giving. So this particular thing we developed largely from the work of Chalfont into a more general form so that we could assess access to nature, not just on all scales. That's basically the idea. And this contrasts the first rather idyllic situation that we showed. Now we can see how access to nature for the people living in these flats is severely compromised in every respect, both visually, audibly, olfactorily, and also by actual physical access, because access across here will be difficult. Maybe it's not pleasant here, and it's not until here that we actually achieve nature. So there's a very big difference, and this obviously could have impact from a level of planning, even down to detailed design, whether from sitting in the room, what they can see through the balcony, what is how it's interrupted. And also in this section, we looked at pet keeping, gardening, attracting wildlife. I'll put these all three together. I think it's very unusual. I've never, in my experience of working with architects, ever heard of them making any design response to enable people to keep animals or pets. And yet about a third of households have a household pet. And I think it's possibly even gone higher now with the COVID lockdown. And yet we just seem to just think they're going to just fit into sort of the human environment. Well, that is often causes friction with neighbours. And so I think the idea of planning for people to have animals is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. There is some very good data on this. So it's not just a romantic whim about animals. And this has also been well researched, the benefits of gardening as therapy. Gardening in itself attracts wildlife. It involves community action. So we're beginning to see how designing for this can meet some of the requirements of some of those earlier codes of practice. Attracting wildlife. Wildlife does come in cities. Clearly, it's mainly avian, and there are ways of attracting this, use of water, and it may well be that we will be taking seriously the actual production of food soon in cities as we move into the next few decades. So now perhaps down to a more familiar area. There was a huge amount of work with this done in the 50s and 60s when the big urban motorways were being planned. And then curiously, the sort of noise has become lower on the list of criteria of interest in courses in environmental design. But it is hugely important. And as you can see, quite relatively recent work, noise pollution, a modern plague, and then we have some fairly conventional scientific work here, noise pollution, non-auditory effects on health. So there is data there, which and for every 2 that you see here, there's another 20 or 50 papers that are equally relevant. So there really is need for design guidance on noise mitigation to be just part of normal design skills in a book which is meant to assist in housing design. And many of these can be found in technical notes and things of the 60s, but it needs to just become part of mainstream design. Often still one will hear of people trying to mitigate traffic noise by distance from the traffic. And of course that is a very poor, due to the nature of how we hear sound and the mathematics of the decibel scale, doubling of distance from a road only reduces it by 3 decibels, which is barely perceptible. And by the time you've doubled a 10-meter distance about 4 or 5 times in order to get 15 decibels reduction, you're already a very long way and you've got a very unusable piece of land in front of you. So we need to do much more creative things. And we've been showing some of the possibilities here, solutions, and also some of the pitfalls, how this is very often not considered, the problem of reflected sound. Thinking of this as light is not such a bad idea. You can make when I started off students earlier teaching, we actually made some light models of buildings to measure reflected sound, because high frequency sound behaves very similarly to reflection of light. Now we would do it, of course, by simulation. And just a little thing here, problems of neighbor noise. I'm only showing these just as typical examples of the way we handle things. We sort of tried to carry out what we call kind of descriptive physics, where people are not worried about equations and quantities other than a fair amount or a little. And yet we feel that it's helpful to understand what the mechanism is. So I'm a great believer in descriptive science, where you understand something without necessarily having the sort of quantitative detail of it. We can see what the World Health Organization thinks of it. Air pollution is a major cause of disease and death. And there seems no signs at the moment of declining, although, again, thanks to COVID, we've seen less urban traffic. And of course, we are seeing the use of low emission and zero emission, or relatively zero emission in the case of electric vehicles. But it is going to take a long time. Incidentally, the electric vehicle issue is, of course, partially a local improvement. There's certainly a local improvement, but if the electricity is still being generated from fossil carbon, as much of the world electricity is, then of course it isn't a global improvement. Okay, these little examples up here are just to show design responses. So we have a noisy road here. We want to get sunlight in from the south, because we'll see another expert will tell us that sunlight is very important. I'm just going to go back. But we don't want to get the polluted air and the noise. So we might have sealed windows there, and we might have an openable ventilation here, very simple solutions. And also we then look out on the sunlit garden. So although we don't have sunlight facing our main access points, we look out on a sunlit area, which psychologically is possibly as good. And this is a little bit more sophisticated idea, an idea we developed some years ago for ventilation preheating from conservatories, when how you did this, you got the preheated air to come in against the wind direction. And this is adapting that idea so that we get relatively clean air. And I actually did show this to Paul Linden when at a CAR Showroom, and he sort of didn't laugh at it and actually confirmed that yes, and we have done some wind tunnel work many years ago to show this worked. And we can draw air in from the downwind side of the building, which in this case is relatively clean, quite a bit cleaner. The pollution falls off very rapidly, particularly particulate pollution from the road. So we can have openings here and get relatively clean air, even when the wind is blowing from the heavily polluted area. And this is by exploiting the negative pressure at the top of in the roof, at the top, over the surface of the roof. Now, I should sort of develop a bit of a theme that when we started the book, by the way, I think we were in a sort of lull in environmental concern. It was sort of the growing concern on food security, and to some extent, because I remember talking to Koen, and we said, well, we're just going to assume people already accept the global warming issue and the need for energy conservation. We're not going to sort of drive it home. We'll just assume that's as read. But since then, things have, in the 4 years that it's taken us to write the book, I hesitate to say, things have moved on, and we have all sorts of changes of awareness, even if the actual situation, well, the situation has changed in 4 years, but the awareness seems to have changed a great deal. We're talking about food security, and we're talking about energy security, and we're talking about absolute vital needs to reduce our carbon emissions. And so I'm gradually sowing the seeds of the idea that we're now really into a kind of survival situation. And we do have to think ahead of how severe conditions might get, and we may be designing, if we're designing for the future, which clearly buildings do last a long time, we have to think of how, for example, supposing energy became almost unobtainable. Well, the answer we know is that passive buildings are far better, perform far better in the absence of energy for servicing. So our norm should be a passive building. And this diagram is just generating the fact that the building fabric itself here it's got a sort of fail-safe, which would be a much better building to live in than many buildings that relied on high level of sophisticated servicing. And really, as part of that, that has a role to play in, adaptive comfort has a role to play in the idea of a building which can look after itself. And this is a subject which some of you know that it's dear to my heart, and I've been involved in some time, simply explaining that if we have adaptive opportunity, and by that we mean ability to alter the environment or else our relationship to the environment, then we can cope with a much bigger swing of stimuli, such as temperature, for example, than we can if we have poor adaptive ability or no adaptive ability in a highly serviced building or indeed in a climate chamber. And so we should be trying to move our buildings down into this area with lots of adaptive opportunity. And here I've just given some examples, a couple of examples. This is sort of building in adaptive opportunity. We've got a sunny room here, which if you sit here, you're going to get hot. And here we have a shady room, which may be able to be nicely ventilated. So by simply choosing where you are, you can regulate your own thermal balance and thermal comfort. It also gives a different sort of feeling to the space. So it enriches the space, partly due to the thermal variance, but also due to the actual sort of spatial variance, because here we're near the outside. And then this is not suggesting we go back to coal fires or anything, but this is suggesting that we revisit the idea of point sources of heat in buildings and possibly coolness, rather than struggling for uniformity. The classic stove had an enormous range of radiant intensities because it was a sort of point source, and simply by moving closer to it or further away from it, we could adjust our own particular thermal comfort. And this, of course, is lost in buildings which have struggled to produce great uniformity. Right, well, I'm nearly finished now. Effects of sunlight and daylight. This has always played a big part in sort of the notion of health in buildings. This illustration here by Corbusier shows the two faces of sunlight, the rather wicked face of damage and overheating, and the good face of all the beneficial things it does. We all know about vitamin D, but also many other less technical issues, but more psychological issues. And so in the end, it's quite difficult to unscramble this. So one of the things we did was to make this table, which I think now needs improving as I look at it. As you always see, think mistakes and things that you would have done when you look at your book when it's published. But it actually shows the various health effects, what the active agent is and mechanism, and then references of where the relevant work has been done. And it shows that it ranges a great deal from both good and bad effects. So therefore, again, that makes it difficult to say, do we need lots of sun in our buildings or do we not? But what it does say is that if we're going to have lots of sun in the building, we must be able to control it. So again, it comes back to adaptability and controllability. Also interested in artificial light, and LEDs have really given us a wonderful opportunity now, which we only just had with compact fluorescence and fluorescence, and we didn't really have with incandescent, quite apart from the fact that the energy consumption is reduced by almost a factor of 10. So we have great possibilities. Here we can see a white LED, that's a sort of middle of the range, bright white LED. And compared with the daylight spectrum, it is not the same, but it is relatively continuous and has light color in all parts of the spectrum. Compared with, say, fluorescence, very much better. And compared with incandescent, of course, it is much more white and less red light. So what I'm really showing this for is not to go into too much detail, but just to show that we now have a palette with which we can work our artificial lighting to actually coincide with our biological needs. It is established, well, I haven't got the references here, but we've got papers, track papers down which relate the color temperature of light with people's preferences at different times of the day. And this has a huge effect in the circadian synchrony, so that we need blue light in the morning and we need to synchronize our circadian rhythm, and we need red light in the evening time. And this, of course, well, we don't know quite what natural cause this relates to, but probably the idea of preparing people in the morning for action and preparing people for sleep when there is no light available. So maybe the warmer light of sunset and firelight is something which has affected our evolutionary response. Another issue which to some extent is a little bit more surprising is the light distribution. And many people, unfortunately, I'm hidden behind some images here of people, but I can't see where I'm putting the cursor. But these two little illustrations show two rooms which nominally have the same illumination on the work plane, so they would be regarded as being equally illuminated, and yet clearly the lighting environment is very, very different. This is much more like lighting in the daytime, because the light from the sky is usually extended, either the blue sky or certainly the white sky is a very extended source coming mainly from above. Whereas the light here is much more reminiscent of, say, moonlight, where we have luminous objects, much lower brightness than in instance, against a dark background. And so we get very strong shadows, whereas here we get very small shadows. Now, there has been some work done in offices on whether people prefer diffuse light or very directional light, and it has been found that people prefer diffuse light in the daytime, and then they do that. This is in offices, so as soon as it's dark outside, they begin to expect a more directional light. Now that's interesting, but can we extrapolate that to a housing situation? Well, that's again the jump of faith that we have to make. Finally, our design scenario was we had student housing, we had refurbishment of Victorian terraces, we had about 7 or 8 high-rise 1960s flats. But this one I've just chosen very briefly to talk about. This was the conversion of a 1970s bungalow, which grew and grew. And so the original bungalow, which was just this part here, has grown, first of all, in one phase, and then this very big phase here. So there are now, I think, 18 rooms, 19 rooms. And we showed how we could try to adopt some of the issues that we had brought up in the text, in the earlier text. We showed how these could be adopted in these design scenarios in a sort of plausible way. So, you know, yeah, it wasn't costing them out, it wasn't consulting structural engineers, but hopefully it was plausible and illustrated how they might in general be adopted. So we had things like vertical gardening along here, so that people looking out at these things didn't look at a blank fence, they looked at a planted wall. We had planted courtyards, so these people had views we had provision for horticulture under cover or under semi-cover. Then we had this new part of the build, this new wing, which obstructed the view of distant fields and woodland. We planted that so that it would, with tall plants, as unusual for roof planting, so that it could be seen, the tall plants could be seen, small trees could be seen through here and seen as almost as part of the landscape. Lighting varied in color temperature from day and night. It varied to a very low level at night in a low color temperature and low luminance, and then in the daytime it was in the morning and daytime it was high color temperature and also higher intensity. We had deliberately advocated the idea of thermal variation so that people would come across areas where it was very cool and other areas where it was very warm and cozy and various other things. And also what we've called caretaker controls. These are controls where people are encouraged to use them, alter them, but they return back to a preset setting after a time. These are relaxing controls. We call them caretakers. It's as if a polite caretaker comes along and says, "Are you sure you want that window open? Are you sure you want that light on? And if not, I'll turn it off." So that's the concept there. And the other great thing is the client for this, because there was a real client, and it is a real project, although this isn't quite as it was done, said that they wanted natural ventilation. Now, it's quite interesting to think that with the COVID issue, and particularly in care homes, how much that was needed. There is a constant battle between temperature and ventilation because, of course, the people are very inactive, so they need quite high temperatures. Natural ventilation will be costly in the winter in terms of heating, so there's an interesting sort of conflict there. But it is to be possible to, with this density of people, to ventilate is quite a challenge for natural ventilation. Okay, now my conclusions. Am I all right for time, Natasha? Hannah?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. Conclusions then. So the interpretation of evidence-based research is not straightforward. Many of you I might be just telling you something you're completely aware of, but it came as a bit of a shock to us to find out how difficult it is to find the paper that justifies you doing or saying what you are precisely. So you have to make some considerable extrapolations and you have to use judgment. I often think, well, we do actually accept advice from a lot of people because we sort of trust them. If you buy a good cookery book and it says, you know, you beat the eggs for 5 minutes, you don't say, why can't I do it for 7 minutes? Or why can't I do it for 3 minutes? Where's the evidence? You just do accept him because you think the writer's, well, he's a pretty good cook or chef and I trust him. So we sort of do need to do that in technical books to some extent. Otherwise, we're going to get to the extent that we will never say anything unless it is actually been sort of determined, and that will limit us a great deal. So that might be a point for discussion afterwards and people's opinion on that. There is a great deal of difficulty in weighting issues which lead to conflicting design parameters. So big windows, little windows, lots of ventilation, not so much ventilation, all of those things. I cited some other examples in the book. But we do believe that adaptive opportunity in a building allows occupants to make these weighting decisions in situ. So just as someone can decide to sit out in a busy street in the snarling traffic and pollution and noise, because they decide to do it, and if they don't like it, they can go in and have their coffee indoors, then we think that if somebody decides that they want for a little while to open the window onto a noisy street, they should be allowed to. So it is the ability of adaptivity that allows people to be more tolerant of non-optimum situations. So not trying to find the solution, the perfect balance, but leaving the balance to be made easily in a nice, ergonomically easy way and an understandably easy way for the occupants. And also, we really do have to think cautiously about the future and begin to develop sort of fail-safe solutions. We have to wonder how our buildings would work in, let's say, another pandemic. Well, we've got one now to see how buildings work. That will inform us a great deal about, I think. And also to think of, say, energy, huge, massive energy shortages. And a sort of final conclusions. Are healthy buildings affordable? And by affordable, I mean, when we consider the health of well, actually, I shouldn't have said health there, but are they affordable by the individual? So can we provide healthy buildings affordably? I have to say, a bit to my concerns, the illustrations that we ended up with in the book often were not exactly low-cost buildings, and this is a very beautiful staircase and probably not what one would find in low-cost building. We know at the moment the problem of housing and the shortage of housing and the shortage really of money to buy housing, which is probably equally key to the problem. And then there is, of course, the health of the planet. So are we justified in spending a lot of materials or even energy on some occasions, providing a healthy environment when this is not good for the health of the planet? And I think, without being too dramatic, I think events are overtaking us as we speak. And really, we can't go on with this self-delusion of sustainability. Quite apart from the fact that some things we don't want to sustain, I don't think should be sustained. But even if they were all desirable, it really, I think we should gradually move to a word survivability, and we should be thinking how our buildings are going to perform in the next decade or even 3 or 4 decades. Okay, well I'm finished, and hopefully there will be some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was great. I was just going to say, in terms of questions, please feel free to ask them. So as I said, you can either raise your hand and there should be a button on the bottom of your screen, and then we can get you on video asking the question. Or you can type it in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we can ask it on your behalf. A great sort of, just spotted the dog there. So yes, whilst I'm asking the first question, maybe if people either raise their hands or sort of type them in the box, that would be great. So mine is, you actually touched on it a little bit, Nick, already, in terms of future developments, but obviously in light of COVID-19, I wonder if there's any aspects of the book which you think are more or less applicable to what some are calling our new normal. So you touched on some aspects in terms of natural ventilation, access to nature, people buying more dogs, maybe even we have climbing walls in the house. But yes, it would just be good if you could kick off with that.
Well, I think that I actually didn't illustrate what we're talking about in natural ventilation, because there are not many sort of illustrations that can quickly encapsulate. But I think the idea of natural ventilation being something that we don't sort of fight, doesn't fight the heating. Now, one of the things that will help that is to go back more to radiant heating. We have this curious notion of space heating, which is heating spaces and not people, and then the people just might happen to be there. You know, this is a terribly costly way of heating a building, and we may have to go into to a much more non-uniform approach to heat. This will allow us to have much freer ventilation. This will please some people listening to this, but it does go back to a much more historic kind of way we used our houses. So furniture was designed to be in itself more protective. So our winter furniture would be perhaps upholstered and enclosing, whereas our summer furniture may be light and well ventilating. So we'll have to think more of our designing a more natural environment that we can use our skills that we use outside. You know, when we're cold, we walk in the sunlight. When we're hot, we walk in the shade. We don't need a degree in thermal transfer to understand that. And we need to be able to use that approach in buildings. This will allow us to ventilate much more freely, which will which will be help in the event of pandemic like we've got now. Can I just elaborate on that? I've got a very simple CO2 meter running now. When I came in here, it said 500 parts. Now it is saying 739. And just me being here has risen the CO2 level. Now, for every bit of CO2 I produce, I probably produce a few micro droplets. So CO2 is a very good indication of the human occupation effect on and what I've noticed, because using this new toy around the house, is that quite without noticing it, it can quite often go to well over 1,000. We use 1,000 as a criterion often in automatic systems, but that is frequently excelled in houses. And obviously, if a couple of friends come in for a few beers and sit in a chat, then we may well be into an area where we're having quite very second-hand air. And so I'm not surprised at all at the new COVID regulations. So much more ventilation, even if it's colder.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We have many questions, so
right.
That's wonderful.
Right. Okay.
Before I do that, I would like to say that you'll be pleased to know that there are 55 people attended today, and you'll be pleased to know that we haven't lost anyone yet. So
oh,
great.
good. They've not got.
Okay. So I see a number of hands raised right now. So I will invite you to the panel and. Okay, and then please remember to unmute yourself and turn on your video, please. So.
Oh, hello, Sumita.
Hi, Nick. Hi,
hello.
Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating lecture. I felt I was back at Martin Center.
Oh dear.
So as I'm getting older, I have concerns about how to adapt the house to, things that older people experience. So one of the things I've been very concerned is with eyesight that diminishes and also mobility. So a lot of older people get into hospitals because they have falls. And I'm also obviously interested in adapting homes, because a lot of people don't want to move out of their homes. They want to live where they are living, which is nice because they know everybody. It's a familiar environment, but it's not safe for them. But it's also good from the point of being sustainable. So you have retrofit solutions, and you can adapt. You can put those and adapt your home to it. So I was wondering, and also you showed the house as a gym. So the house could be adapted to become induced mobility. I don't think an older person would necessarily go on the climbing wall, but perhaps, some little things. So those kind of little adaptations to make homes usable for older population, which include encouraging movement, and somehow adapting the lighting to inside the house so that they're not falling, or they can actually go about their daily business. So that's one question. How do we do that, and whether you think that's a good idea? And the second thing I've been looking into is the high-tech solution, which is embedding things into walls that check your blood pressure, your eyesight, and things like that. And if you need help, that alerts somebody in a hospital. So those two things, if you could please elaborate on that. Thank you.
Well, I think both are very important. I have to say that the issue about making buildings safe, retro safe for aging people is I think a very interesting one. It is really beyond the remit of the book, although as soon as people ask questions like that, I think, oh dear, we should have spent more time on that. We do generally, and rather sadly, refer to older people as having limited mobility. So we consider there are several instances where we're considering people that are not very mobile or have difficulty in moving around. And we certainly consider about lighting. For example, unfortunately, many older people get up in the night and many falls occur due to bad lighting. People switch full daytime lighting on, so their eyes adapt to that, and then they switch the lights off, and it's very, very dark. So there are such simple technologies to put lights that are occupancy sensing, they're dimming, they controlled on a program, so that at night all lighting everywhere is dimmer, and with possible override. All of those things, we do mention that, but I think you're absolutely right. There's a great need now for another book on that specifically addresses the issue of the health of older people in homes and being able to adapt them. And as for the high-tech situation, this is a fairly low-tech book. We don't actually talk about that. I think it is very interesting. There are many developments of I know of sort of micro monitoring modules which you can swallow or sit on or stick in various parts of your body, and it'll tell your doctor exactly what you need. Sounds to me quite a good idea, but we haven't dealt with it here. I think the most the area where sort of the technical issues arise most is in this idea of the caretaking control systems. Control systems are actively encourage you to use them, but also interact in the sense that they then will return them back to a safe and non-conflicting setting. And I think there is some real mileage in control systems of that sort. I'd be interested to hear from anybody in the audience who has that area of interest and expertise. Anyhow, thank you, Samita. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. There's another hand. Welcome, Peter. Please remember to unmute yourself and turn on your, yeah, there you go.
Hello, Peter. Hello.
Yes, thanks for your talk. One of the things I'm involved in at the moment is chairing design review panels in London particularly. And one of the most depressingly common building typologies is single aspect flats. It's a medium rise blocks of flats with a central corridor and single aspect flats on either side. And quite often the job of the planning authority tends to be to kind of minimize the number of single aspect flats, or at least to minimize the number of north facing or indeed south facing single aspect flats, and just rely on east or west facing flats. What's your view about single aspect flats? I mean, should they be banned altogether, do you think? Or are there ways in which you can mitigate? I mean, obviously, developers will argue that that's necessary to have single aspect flats for viability, or in some cases also to justify 2 lift calls, so that for disabled access, you've always got a spare lift when the lift needs to be repaired. So that there are some reasons which one can understand why that typology is common. I just wonder whether you have a view about single aspect flats, and whether you have any ideas about how, if one has to have single aspect flats, how the downsides of them can be mitigated by design.
I think that's very interesting, because this was one of the issues that we had at the VLUX seminars, was that you cannot possibly plan a bit of urban development and have every building facing the perfect direction for the morning sunlight and the evening sunlight and so on. It is impossible. It would be such a limitation on our planning. So I mean, I'm trying to keep my answer short. I think that if a north-facing flat faces potentially a sunlit view, and certainly at relative medium scale, if the sun can get, we actually show an example of this in one of our case studies, in one of our scenarios. A north-facing flat facing a sunlit area can have perhaps as much kind of psychological effect as sun streaming in the building, scorching people in summer, and causing glare. So I don't think that a north view is necessarily, I don't think it's worth banning it. So I don't think north-facing flats should be banned, definitely not. Not quite apart from the fact that, of course, in summer, these flats actually get morning sunshine, and quite nice low-angle morning sunshine and evening sunshine. So it is only the winter time where So, but of course, at the scale of the flats, it's difficult to manipulate the space outside. But we do need to think of the space outside as well. Reflected light is a very important way that we get light in dense urban environments, and we can't just look upon the sky. So, interesting problem. Sorry. Right.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. We see that there's another hand raised, but we'll go to the Q&A first, and then we'll come back to you. So
carrying on with the lighting topic, there's a question from Madeline Hoburn. Hopefully I've said your name correctly. They've said, regarding sunlight in buildings, would you say that using these adaptive LEDs could completely replace natural lighting in buildings, or is it our affiliation with the outdoor environment that is irreplaceable?
Right, well, I have strong views on that, because I really do believe that the value of daylight is not just purely a physical issue. It is because we know it's daylight. And there have been various experiments done where people have had roof lights which have obscure translucent material in them, so people couldn't tell if it were daylight or carefully programmed artificial light. And the effects, the beneficial effects, seem to be reduced. And so I think it's absolutely important that the daylight is seen to come from outside, and that is part of its value. I think that having simulated daylight in spectral terms certainly serves a function in terms of good visual acuity. We could, I suppose, provide some UV, which would serve the other effects of sunlight, but I think that a very essential part is the link to the outside. That's why windows are such lovely things, because they link sound, smell, sight, and light all together, all in one simple element that is intuitively operated. Great.
Thank you. Shall we do one more from the Q&A, and then we'll go to the raised hands? So one more from Tim Mellor, and he's asked, isn't there a great need that we need to look at mitigating pollution from traffic in urban areas where there is only natural ventilation? What are the best ways that we can address that in simple terms?
Right. Yes, well, I think we need to know much more about the pollution climate around roads. We need to look, and I'm sure I say we need to, I think this is being looked at, the sources of pollution. Clearly, electric vehicles will make a big difference, but one of the pollutants is tire dust and other sort of lubricant emissions and things of that kind. So we're not going to be without pollution problems with all electric vehicles. So if we know the microclimate of pollution, and this is something that can be arrived at maybe by careful modeling of airflows around buildings, and then we need for the buildings to respond. At the moment, I don't think they do particularly respond. We will have facades with openable windows onto, with no real special recognition of the fact that they're polluted. And of course, there may be technical fixes, such as we may get vision through the window, but we might draw air in through filtration. We're using filtration. This is mentioned in the book, and there is, you know, quite a market for filtration, but it is energy intensive, and it's not terribly good, not terribly effective, and it doesn't imitate natural ventilation. A bit like the daylight question, if your fresh air comes out of a grill, you don't really believe in it, and you don't enjoy it as much as you do throwing open a window. So the answer is quieter, cleaner cities. That's the answer. Yeah.
Okay, there's another hand. Oh, it's Tim Miller from the same question. He may have some other questions. Please unmute yourself and start the video. In the meantime, there's a quick question from Ola Uduku about the book, whether it is going to go into paperback form.
Oh, right. I don't know. I don't know. They will go, and it is available as an ebook. And so, yes, so I think quite soon it will do. And yeah, yes, hopefully. And hello, Ola. Nice of you to be here. I shall send CAR the bill for this.
I think Tim's unmuted now. So, Tim, are you there?
Oh, Tim's got another question, right.
Oh dear. Yeah,
You're very quiet. But...
Just have to shout.
Oh, are you there, Tim?
I'm here, Nick. Thank you.
All
very
right,
much.
right,
Nice to see you.
right.
No, it's just that it seems to be the idea that we open the windows in certain areas of urban areas, and actually as if it's a safe thing to do. And in fact, as I visit people in cities now, not so much in the last 7 months, I notice cities are more polluted. It's just the smell when you enter them if you live in a country.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And this is, opening windows is not always the answer for people in their current situations.
No.
Looking at ways, if we can't reduce pollution in cities, are there ways we can simply bring air into buildings without, obviously, large-scale mechanical ventilation and air conditioning?
Well, I sort of like to think that the little example I gave is a way towards that. It doesn't, if you remember the idea of making the building sort of linking it with a duct to the roof surface, and then only having openings on the clean side of the building. This allows air to be drawn in almost any, by stack effect or by wind effect. It allows air to be drawn in from a selected area, which if we did a little bit of field work and research, we could find out what the sort of morphology of the arrangement of the building line and the fencing or anything like that, maybe vegetation, that gave the best result for air cleanliness. Now, I don't think it will affect sort of gaseous pollutants so much, but it will affect particular particulates. And so, but that's not my area of expertise, but I think there is the possibility that we can be selective about the air that we draw into our buildings by design of the building itself, without resorting to mechanical ventilation.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So we've got a comment which I can read out from Robin Pender, which is, Nick, you are so right about the papers. If we have to prove everything by a previous reference, then by definition we can never progress. It's more about feedback, learning from what we try and passing that learning on in a timely way. And again, that means not over-referencing. So that's more of a comment than a question.
Yes,
so
well, thank you, Robin, for that comment. That's very, very nice. Thank you.
And then I'll move on to a question from Edwards, which is, thank you, Nick, for another insightful lecture. My experience working with designers and planners is that it is not important to be precise and absolutely correct. However, try not to be obviously wrong. This gives them room to do their design balancing act. So I guess that's more of a comment again, but maybe reflect on those two comments.
Yes, well, thank you. That is interesting. Thank you, yes.
And then this one does have a question mark, so it is a question. So thank you for the comments. And so Patricia Ferraro Senior, hopefully that is said correctly. She says, thank you again. Great to hear about how to integrate design into healthier homes. Do you think that the way things are going, there is more reliance on mechanical ventilation systems to solve design issues in an artificial manner, especially in high-end residential projects? People seem to be expecting more than what the building envelope can offer.
Right. Well, yes, I think that is happening. That isn't, of course, because I support it. I think it's a pity. And mechanical ventilation does need energy, it needs maintenance, it has negative effects, possibly in terms of hygiene, it has problems of noise, and there are many things many reasons against it if one could do without it. The problem is that we have poor air quality in many of our urban areas. It's really an extension of the previous question. And so I think that we should still persevere with natural ventilation. And I think it's a combination of improving the air quality outside and also understanding more about the aerodynamics of the way buildings work. I'm so amazed that so often we will see things like extractor fans installed and no obvious ingress point for the air. It's as if someone hasn't just thought that the way air flows from space to space in a building. And so we just need a little bit of more research done on that. And maybe then even natural ventilation becomes a sort of positive thing rather than a second-rate thing to mechanical ventilation. Now, can I just say one more thing too? What makes natural ventilation work possibly will be the backup of mechanical. So very occasionally, I worked on a school in Norway where the classrooms were all naturally ventilated. It had stacked ventilation arrangement, CO2 detectors, and when the level went above 1200 or something like 1200, the mechanical assistant switched in. In fact, it hardly ever switched in, but it was there. And so a very small amount of mechanical intervention can sometimes make predominantly a natural situation, a natural system work. And I think that is and it's a bit like we talk about hybrid buildings, a little bit of air conditioning over a heat wave will suddenly make the rest of that building tolerable for the rest of the year. So yes, I think that's the way forward, really.
Okay, we have 2 more people to be invited to the panel. So there's Jason Palmer and Thomas.
Hello, Jason.
Yeah, so they'll be at the same time, so you can ask your questions.
Hi, Nick. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself.
Hello,
so, I find it hard sometimes to disentangle the evolution that you see in standard approaches from design to design. I find it hard to separate that from evolutions in technology, which open up new opportunities for design. And it strikes me that some of these twin changes, so changes in approach to design and changes in technology, are supportive of the ideas that you've been speaking about. So, for example, being able to control the color temperature of lighting is clearly very useful in ways that are compatible with circadian rhythms. Similarly, solar control glass is helpful in helping to cut out the risk of overheating. But another of the examples you gave, the standard approach now to insulation that allows more uniform temperatures across a building, seems to me to be in conflict with this idea of non-uniform heating. So if you have better quality of insulation, makes it actually more difficult to have some parts of the building cooler and other parts warmer, and then allowing people to move and make their own choices about where they situate themselves. But my question is this: do you think that by and large, the evolution that you see in the standard approach to design and technologies in buildings is supportive of these ideas you have, or is it in the main in conflict with your ideas and fighting against what you're trying to achieve?
Right, I think it's neither. Because, I think I'm often enthused over this idea of caretaker controls which clearly that would be made much easier by wireless connections, by microprocessor controlled or sort of intelligently controlled units. So technology's made something possible. So what makes inviting humans to fiddle around with the controls is the very thing that normally the controls have been relied on. So we're sort of turning the thing on itself. So I like the idea of any level of sort of IT technology and wizardry helping us use controls. So that's a good. On the other hand, there is a sort of fascination that people, if something is technologically possible, it must be done. So I really hate these buildings that go up with great glass double envelope facades full of wonderful devices which are controlled by some wonderfully intelligent computer. To me, they're not intelligent buildings, they're unintelligent buildings, because the building basically should start off making a pretty good environment, and then the alterations that humans are invited to make in response to their requirements should then perhaps gently and politely be put back if forgotten. And that is the idea of the polite caretaker controls. So I don't really think, it's a bit like saying, is science evil or is it good? You know, it's not really that it's on anybody's side. Now, the interesting one you said about the insulation, because of course I put that, you know, in drawing that diagram, I felt it was a good thing. I felt it was good that all this business, all these pipes and pumps and thermostats that we put in our buildings, you know, in order to make every single corner, nook and cranny the same temperature, suddenly all you need is just put a good slug of heat in where you most want it, and all the other rooms will be generally not too bad. And if you go into another room, in 5 minutes you could take some heat in there and you'd be comfortable. This to me is helping. Whereas if indeed you have a building which is so badly insulated that every other room is like going out in the garden, you know, then that's when you say, oh, I think we must get central heating, and that's your next step. So I actually think it's on our side if used correctly. So I'm optimistic about its contribution, really.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Nick. It's really, really inspiring. My question, to a certain extent, follows on from Jason's. A lot of the points you're saying there about variation in temperature, plentiful daylighting, perhaps natural ventilation being preferable to mechanical ventilation, a lot of that seems contrary to some of the basic tenets of Passive House in particular.
Yes.
Do you see Passive House as part of the solution, perhaps, with good caretaker controlling, or do you think these things are fundamentally incompatible?
It's a difficult one, that. I don't really, I have mixed views. I mean, what I do notice that the Passive House is relaxed a little bit, because it certainly is talking about being fairly free running in the summer, which and using shading and things like that to control things which we associate as sort of passive features. But I do wonder what a passive house would be like in a warm climate, and after all, a large part of the world lives in a hot climate. So how would it handle cooling? How would it handle comfort from overheating? And I also wonder how they will age, and I wonder how, when things go wrong in a passive house, how inhabitable they are. So I do have mixed feelings. I wouldn't want to live in a passive house. I'd rather live in my 18th century cottage, which has leaky windows, and we have a fire here, just down there, which I get close to when it gets cold. But that's, you know, my eccentric whim, I suppose. But I think I don't really think passive house is going to be the answer, but who knows what's the answer. So
can I say something as well?
Yes.
Just having worked on a job where we had turrets doing some natural ventilation, and I found that the inhabitants can't cope with the variation in temperature and the bit of draft, and they, you know, and a feeling of a lack of control because there's some carbon dioxide detection, and they have to just rely on that rather than opening something. Seems to me there's just a huge amount of education and encouragement for people to use their own bodies to cope with a variety of environmental conditions, and I don't know how we're going to do that, but it needs to be done on such a massive scale.
I think that's, you know, you can buy a book on driving, you can buy a book on sailing, you can buy a book on flying, but you don't buy a book on running your house. You know, we just do not understand the simple physics of houses and people. I mean, I can so remember going into a house with there's some flats doing some work for London Borough of Tower Hamlets or something. Went in the flats, and they had terrible condensation problems, and mold growing, just dreadful stuff. And went in there, and then the council had fitted extractor fans with automatic sensors that sensed humidity and switched them on. And guess what? The people had papered over them because they said it cost them too much in heating. And it was incredible. You just sort of thought, well, you know, where do you start? Explaining to them that the moisture that is causing their clothes to rot in the bedroom was the same moisture that came from their all-day kettle that was sitting on the hob and their clothes drying in the kitchen. But to them, you know, they couldn't make that connection about humidity and things like that. So it is difficult because we don't really understand everyday physics very, very well. So maybe, you know, schools should be telling people how to use their houses. I do think that, actually. I mean, it sounds strange, but we learn about religions of the world, we learn about obscure bits of the economy and things like that, and yet we don't actually know how to live our everyday lives. And we don't understand the implications of opening a window, which is incredible. What amazes me with this COVID thing, you know, we've had infectious diseases recorded for 10 centuries, and yet we still don't really know whether people are infected with COVID by coughing at them, or whether it's the air in the room, or whether it's touching surfaces. Well, we've taken a year to decide that it probably isn't touching surfaces. It is extraordinary, isn't it, that something as global as this we know so little about. And yet we you know, you buy new scientists. I'm going on a rant now, by the way, I'll warn you. Go buy new scientists and it's half full of black holes. Half of new scientists, no, I'm exaggerating, every week black holes get there. And I want to write to new scientists and say, what use is a black hole? You know, here we are arguing about whether we should wash our hands or not. It's crazy. Okay. Rant over. Sorry about the rest of you. Sorry.
So there's a couple more comments, and then I'll just round up with one last sort of. There's two questions, but I'll just ask them together, and then we should probably sort of wrap it up. But sort of Bill Bordas said, surely there's no excuse for designers not making things look good, whatever the budget. And then Byron Chan has said, is asking, are there any good environmental books or guides you recommend generally for sustainable design that are easily accessible and understandable for architectural designers? And then the last one is still on the ventilation topic, and that has been put forward by Dai Hay. And to continue Peter Studdart's question, the issues of lack of cross ventilation available in single aspect flats is very widespread. It's clear from plan layouts when this won't work to achieve summer cooling and increasing demand for fresh air. Is this on your agenda?
Right, I'm going to take them in reverse order because
that makes sense.
I think that we should look more at using corridors as ventilation ducts. So corridors are areas of low pollution, and so we should look about them. And there have been cases of hospitals and things where the corridors are seen as ventilation ducts. They're nice big ducts, so there's a lot of air can be moved around them. So, and I think it's a very interesting aspect, this business of double bank rooms, double bank corridors, double loaded corridors, how we use them to ventilate. So circulation spaces obviously could be used as a source of air. Right, next question back was, oh God.
So we had the recommendations for books.
Yes, I recommend, and this is, my scribble diagrams were transformed into those rather nice, colourful diagrams by a chap called Ben Shannon. And he has written 2 books. I think he's just written a recent book. He's an architect and he did the artwork for us. And I would recommend his books. Very, very, very good. I think he's written a book on just housing and maybe the sort of equivalent for non-domestic. And it is a sort of scrapbook of different environmental solutions. So, and then the first question was?
So then we had Bill Bordas. Yeah, and there was surely there is no excuse for designers not making things look good, whatever the budget.
I completely agree with him. And the pictures that I showed and they're in the book do look good. I absolutely agree, but they also look expensive, and because they involve quite a lot of space. But I do agree, and I think that we could. I think we could have. All I know is that if I were really needing shelter, I would be happy for less space, and I would be quite happy for space that is not, you know, luxuriously finished with expensive materials and expensive workmanship. So I think that yes, definitely yes, cheap things can look good, and we don't need as much space as we're having at the moment. At the moment, we occupy on average twice as much space per person than we did in the 1950s. And really, when you think we've got a housing shortage, that's scandalous. I mean, a lot of it is due to the way families work out, and families are smaller, and yet buildings didn't shrink. But there is a real problem that we need to address, that we are occupying too much space, and we're also heating that space and maintaining that space. So that's why our consumption, partly why our consumption goes up. Okay, anyhow, thank you, Bill, for that question.
I was going to say, do you have a couple of concluding sentences, and then I will.
Well, that's very nice to give me back. You know, I tend to talk a lot. Well, it's been, first of all, very nice that people have asked these questions, and I think I got a sort of quite sympathetic response on the issue of the way we use referee journal articles to translate. I mean, the Martin Centre has always said it translates research into practice. And the route it takes is interesting. Sometimes at Martin Centre, it itself did very, very basic research and then made a big leap and sort of didn't quite know what practice it was going to go to. And you know, Martin Centre, Leslie Martin's work started off like that. It was sort of doing almost mathematical research, and then it made a big leap into saying this is how we should plan our buildings. And so I think that is a really interesting issue, the way we can. I've been asked to do talks sometimes on sort of research methods. So they know I've done research, so surely I know how to do it. Well, that's very kind of people to think that, but I'm not sure. But I do see there's a sort of process. Research involves usually getting data, and then we sort of process the data. And I think it's sort of nice to say now you've got knowledge about the subject, but that doesn't give you wisdom. So the wisdom comes when you can use that knowledge in unimaginable situations, or in hitherto unimaginable situations. In other words, we've got to go sort of one step further to convert knowledge into wisdom. And I think somewhere you need a bit of that when you're taking a paper that has been working with people with learning difficulties in America who've been deprived of contact with nature, and you're saying that if we build houses in the southeast of England, we should build them with bigger gardens or something, or if we're going to build 6, all flats should have a terrace that someone can put potted plant and a pigeon cage on. You know, that's a big step, but somehow you've got to have that courage or something to do that. Otherwise, we will just grind to a halt. It's this risk-averse society which wants proof of everything, and we're not going to get it. And it'll be too late if we do get it. Okay, that's my final.
I think that's a good sentence to finish on. So just to everyone still here, thank you so much for listening. As I said at the start, this was our first sort of online car showroom, and we're really hoping that sort of whilst we can't be there in person, that we can continue this on a monthly basis. So we'll keep you updated.
The next one.
Yeah.
Yes, and we look forward to it.
Check out our Twitter as well. So.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much for me. Thanks again to Natcha, and then also Janet, and of course to Nick for the talk. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.